Part 1. The awakening modern-day Montreal, a bustling city known for its vibrant culture and historical charm, an eerie silence began to descend as dusk fell. The streets, usually alive with the sounds of nightlife, were unusually quiet. News reports had been growing increasingly frantic over the past week, with talk of a strange illness sweeping through the outskirts of the city. But as with many things in the digital age, people paid little heed, engrossed in their own lives and the glow of their screens. Robert, a project manager by day, sat in his home office, his attention divided between a looming deadline and the latest news update flashing on his laptop screen. The report spoke of hospitals being overrun, but the cause was still unknown. Shrugging it off, he turned his focus back to his work, the eerie news fading into the background. Later that night, after tucking his daughters into bed and settling down with his wife to watch a movie, a sudden urgent knocking at the door shattered the tranquility of their home. With a sense of foreboding, Robert approached the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw his neighbor, Mr. Thompson, standing outside, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Robert, you need to see this," Mr. Thompson gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Reluctantly, Robert opened the door, stepping into the cool night air. Mr. Thompson pointed towards the street where a small crowd had gathered, their faces illuminated by the harsh glow of streetlights. They were staring at something on the ground, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. As Robert drew closer, he saw what had captured their attention. A figure shrouded in darkness was staggering towards them. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as if every step was a battle. The figure's clothes were tattered, and its skin had an unnatural pallor. A chill ran down Robert's spine as the figure came into the light, revealing its true horror. Its face was grotesque, partly decayed, with soulless eyes that seemed to stare into nothingness. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the realization hit them. The dead were walking among them. Panic ensued as people scrambled to get away, but Robert stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. The creature lurched forward, its arms reaching out as if driven by a primal hunger. It was then that Robert's survival instincts kicked in. He turned and ran back to his house, slamming the door shut behind him. His heart raced as he locked the door, the sound of his pounding heart deafening in his ears. His wife, alarmed by the commotion, met him in the hallway. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. Robert struggled to find the words. "We need to barricade the doors and windows, now," he said, his voice urgent. As they hurried to secure their home, the news continued to play in the background, the reporter's voice growing more frantic. Reports were coming in from all over the city. The dead had risen, and they were attacking the living. Montreal, a city once full of life, was now the backdrop for a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. As the night deepened, the sounds of chaos and despair echoed through the streets, a grim reminder of the horror that had been unleashed. And so, the night of the living dead began anew, a modern horror unfolding in a world unprepared for the darkness that had awakened. Part 2. The City in Chaos. The night had turned into a canvas of terror, painting Montreal in shades of horror and disbelief. Robert and his family, barricaded inside their home, listened to the cacophony of chaos erupting outside. The screams of the terrified, the groaning of the undead, and the incessant sirens created a symphony of dread that seemed to have no end. Outside, the city streets had transformed into a battleground. The dead, risen with an insatiable hunger for the living, roamed the streets. Their numbers were growing, each victim adding to the ranks of the undead. The once familiar neighborhoods of Montreal were now unrecognizable, engulfed in a nightmare that defied logic and reason. In his living room, Robert huddled with his family, trying to comfort his daughters, who were too young to understand the full extent of the horror unfolding outside. His wife, a pillar of strength in times of trouble, clung to hope, praying for a miracle. As the night wore on, their safe haven began to feel more like a prison. Food supplies were limited, and the constant wail of emergency broadcasts provided no comfort, only a grim tally of the spreading chaos. The reports were sporadic and increasingly desperate. The military was mobilized, safe zones were being established, but nothing seemed to stem the tide of the undead. Robert, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, remembered his YouTube channel, Haunt Narratives. In a world gone mad, the idea of telling scary stories seemed almost absurd, yet he felt a strange urge to document what was happening, to leave a record of their survival against impossible odds. As dawn approached, a new horror presented itself. The power grid, overwhelmed by the crisis, began to fail. The lights flickered and then died, plunging the city into darkness. The loss of power brought a new level of fear. The safety of their home felt even more fragile in the pitch black. In the eerie silence that followed, a more immediate danger became apparent. They could hear them now, the guttural moans of the undead, eerily close and growing closer. The sound of shuffling feet, the scraping of hands against their door, the faint but unmistakable scent of decay. It was all closing in on them. Robert's mind raced. They couldn't stay here much longer. Their home was no longer a sanctuary, but a tomb waiting to be sealed. But where could they go? The city was a labyrinth of death, each street potentially leading to a dead end, both figuratively and literally. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in their boarded-up windows, a plan began to form in Robert's mind. They needed to leave, to find one of the rumored safe zones. It was a gamble, but staying put was a certain death sentence. He turned to his wife, his eyes conveying a mix of fear and determination. "We can't stay here," he whispered. "We need to get out of the city." But even as he spoke, the sounds outside grew louder, more insistent. The dead were at their door, their presence a chilling reminder that the world they knew was gone, replaced by a reality where the living were hunted and the dead ruled the night. Part 3. The Descent into Darkness. As dawn's weak light filtered through the barricaded windows, Robert's resolve hardened. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance. He quietly explained to his family that they needed to leave their home and head for the rumored safe zone outside the city. His wife nodded in silent agreement, understanding the gravity of their situation. They gathered a few essentials, whispering words of encouragement to their daughters, trying to mask their own fear. The family moved stealthily through the house, avoiding making any noise that could attract the undead lurking outside. Robert peered through a small gap in the window coverings. The street was a horrifying tableau of the apocalypse, abandoned cars, littered belongings, and the roaming undead, some grotesquely disfigured, all testament to the nightmare that had befallen Montreal. They decided to exit through the back door, hoping it would offer a safer path. The moment they stepped outside, the cold air hit them, carrying the stench of decay and death. The once familiar backyard was now a foreign landscape, bathed in the eerie light of dawn, casting long, ominous shadows. Moving quietly, they reached the alley behind their house. The city's sounds were different now, a sinister quiet punctuated by distant screams and the unsettling moan of the undead. Every rustle and creak set their nerves on edge, fearing that one misstep could be their last. As they navigated the maze of alleys and side streets, avoiding main roads swarming with the undead, the reality of their situation sank in. Montreal, a city that once pulsed with life, was now a ghost town, its soul ripped out by an unimaginable horror. Their journey was fraught with danger. They encountered small groups of survivors, some armed, some in shock, all scared. Each group told tales of horror and survival, painting a grim picture of the world outside their city. The safe zones were real, they were told, but reaching them was a perilous journey fraught with peril at every turn. Robert and his family pressed on, driven by the slim hope of finding safety. As they moved, the city's landmarks took on a macabre aspect, Familiar streets and buildings were now scenes of horror, with the undead lurking around every corner. Their progress was slow, and as night began to fall again, Robert realized they needed to find shelter. They found an abandoned store, its windows already boarded up. Inside, they found a semblance of safety, but the sense of being trapped was overwhelming. As they settled in for the night, the reality of their situation settled in. They were alone, in a city overrun by the dead, each day a fight for survival. Outside, the moans of the undead were a constant reminder of the peril just beyond the walls. The darkness of the store was suffocating, the silence oppressive. Robert tried to stay vigilant, to keep watch, but exhaustion took its toll, and he drifted into a restless sleep. In his dreams, the city was alive again, vibrant and bustling. But the dream quickly turned into a nightmare, the streets filled with the undead, their ghastly faces haunting him even in his sleep. He awoke with a start, the darkness feeling even more oppressive. The night was far from over, and the real nightmare was waiting for them outside. The journey to safety was just beginning, and the path was fraught with dangers both seen and unseen. In the heart of the darkness, the struggle for survival continued, each moment a battle against the horrors that the night had unleashed. Part 4. The Perilous Path. The night in the abandoned store was long and fraught with tension. Every creak and groan of the building set Robert and his family on edge, fearing that the undead had found them. But dawn eventually broke, casting a dim, gray light into the store through the cracks in the boards. They had survived the night, but the day brought no relief, only the grim realization that they had to continue their perilous journey. As they cautiously left their temporary shelter, the city seemed even more alien than before. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of mourning completely absent. The only sounds were the distant moans of the undead and the occasional distant echo of gunfire, a stark reminder that other survivors were out there, fighting their own battles for survival. Robert led his family through the desolate streets, constantly on the lookout for danger. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every corner a potential ambush. They avoided the undead whenever possible, but sometimes confrontation was inevitable. Robert had armed himself with a makeshift weapon, a grim necessity in this new world. The encounters were brief but terrifying, a stark reminder of how fragile their lives had become. As they navigated through the city, they came across scenes that would haunt them forever. The undead, some still wearing the tattered remnants of their former lives, roamed aimlessly, driven only by their hunger. The living were few and far between, most having either fled the city or fallen victim to the epidemic. The journey was taking its toll on the family, both physically and mentally. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, and the stress of constant vigilance was exhausting. Despite this, Robert's determination never wavered. He knew that their only chance of survival was to reach the safe zone. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of the city. The landscape changed, but the danger remained. The open spaces offered less cover, and the undead seemed to roam more freely here. The family had to be even more cautious, moving quickly but quietly, always on the lookout for danger. As they moved through the outskirts, they encountered other groups of survivors. These encounters were tense. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. Some groups were friendly, sharing information and supplies, but others were hostile, viewing anyone outside their group as a threat or competition for scarce resources. The day was fading when they finally saw it, a barricaded compound, heavily guarded with survivors moving in and out. It was one of the safe zones they had heard about. Relief washed over Robert and his family, but it was quickly replaced by apprehension. Would they be allowed in? What kind of society had formed behind those walls? Approaching the gates, they were stopped by armed guards. The guards were wary but not hostile, asking them a series of questions about where they had come from and if they had been bitten or scratched. After what seemed like an eternity, they were allowed inside. The safe zone was a small community of survivors doing their best to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a world gone mad. There were makeshift homes, a medical center, and even a small school. But the atmosphere was one of grim determination rather than hope. Everyone had lost something or someone to the epidemic, and the weight of that loss hung heavy in the air. As night fell, Robert and his family settled into their new surroundings. They were safe for now, but the world outside the walls was still a nightmare. The undead were still out there, and the fight for survival was far from over. The night in the safe zone was restless, filled with the sounds of people mourning, planning, living. In this new world, every day was a battle, and every night a reminder of the darkness that had descended upon them. The living held on, fighting against the tide of the undead, clinging to the hope that they could reclaim their world from the nightmare that had engulfed it. Part 5. The Fractured Dawn. Inside the safe zone, the days began to blur into one another. Robert and his family adapted to their new reality, a life confined within the walls that offered protection, but also served as a constant reminder of the world they had lost. The community was organized and disciplined, with everyone contributing to the survival of the group. Despite the relative safety, an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty pervaded the air. The undead were just beyond the walls, and the threat of an attack was ever present. As weeks passed, the situation outside the walls grew more dire. Scouting parties reported increasing numbers of the undead, and other safe zones had fallen, overrun by the relentless tide of decay and death. The community's leaders held frequent meetings, discussing strategies to strengthen their defenses and find more sustainable sources of food and water. Robert, once a project manager, now found himself part of the community's defense team. He patrolled the walls, keeping watch for any signs of the undead. The nights were the hardest, filled with the haunting moans of the undead and the occasional distant scream, a stark reminder that others were not as fortunate to have found refuge. One fateful night, a dense fog descended upon the city, cloaking everything in a ghostly shroud. The watchmen on the walls strained their eyes, trying to pierce the thick mist. It was on this night that disaster struck. A horde of the undead, larger than any seen before, emerged from the fog, converging on the safe zone with an eerie, relentless determination. The alarms sounded, jolting the community into action. Robert rushed to his post, his heart pounding in his chest. The scene that unfolded was like something out of a nightmare. The undead were clawing at the walls, their grotesque forms illuminated by the searchlights, a sea of death trying to breach the last bastion of the living. The defenders fought desperately, but the horde was overwhelming. The sound of gunfire, screams, and the ungodly moaning of the undead filled the air, creating a cacophony of terror. Amidst the chaos, Robert fought fiercely, driven by the primal instinct to protect his family and the community that had become their home. As the battle raged, a section of the wall gave way and the undead poured in. The safe zone, once a haven, became a battleground. Robert found himself fighting back-to-back with his fellow survivors, each of them knowing that this could be their last stand. In the midst of the carnage, a glimmer of hope emerged. Some of the community members, including Robert's family, managed to escape through a secret tunnel that led out of the safe zone. As they fled into the night, the sounds of the battle raging behind them, Robert made a split-second decision to stay behind, to buy them time and hold off the horde as long as possible. The last stand at the safe zone was a testament to the resilience and courage of the human spirit. Robert and the remaining defenders fought until the very end, each of them falling one by one, heroes in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The dawn that followed was bleak. The safe zone was lost, its defenders either dead or scattered. The city lay in ruins, a shadow of its former self, now fully in the grip of the undead. For Robert's family and the other survivors who had escaped, the future was uncertain. They faced a world overrun by darkness, a world where survival was a daily struggle. But even in the face of such despair, they carried with them the legacy of those who had fought and fallen, a legacy of bravery, sacrifice, and the unyielding will to survive. In the fractured dawn of a world lost to the night, they moved forward, carrying the faint but unextinguished flame of hope, determined to find a new beginning in the aftermath of the night of the living dead.